Welcome to Lesky, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. In Greek mythology, the creation of the first woman was not complete until she was dressed. In the version of the story that we get from Hesiod's Theogony, as soon as Hephaestus fashioned Pandora from the earth, Athena stepped forward to teach her the arts of needlework and weaving. Mankind had existed before Pandora, but when she was created, clothed, and taught herself to make clothing, human civilization really began. We might think, too, of the Hebrew Bible's book of Genesis, where the awakening of Adam and Eve's sense of shame required the invention of clothing to cover themselves with. You might even say that, if clothes make the man, it's clothing that makes mankind. There was, though, of course, a staggering and often invisible practical reality to that need for clothing. Anyone in antiquity who wore woven pieces was clothed in countless hours of women's manual labor. While we traditionally periodize history today by the metals that humans conquered, so the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and so on, my guest for this episode, Marie-Louise Noche, suggests an alternative framework. What if we viewed and periodized history not through its metals, the work of Hephaestus, but through Athena's domain, that is, through its fibers, the plant fiber age, the wool age, and so on? Marie-Louise is a world-renowned expert in ancient textiles and Linear B. She's also the author, most recently, of a book called Time of Textiles in Ancient Greece, which appeared at the end of 2025 in de Gruyter's Chronois series. That book explores a whole host of ways in which textiles and temporality intersected in antiquity, from the sheer time it took to produce textiles to the life cycles of garments, which in many cases long outlived their original owners. Those garments, the products of so much labor, also often became multi-generational heirlooms and finished their own lives as dedications and sanctuaries, ragged and frayed, yet sacred witnesses to human life. This conversation was a lot of fun because we've ranged over so many forms of evidence, from the depictions of weaving in the Homeric epics, to the notices that we get of ancient textile dedications, to the modern recreation of ancient weaving processes by contemporary master craftspeople. This book and this conversation gave me a lot to think about, not least how fitting it is in so many ways to think of our present age as the age of polyester. Marie-Louise Noche studied ancient Greek history in Nancy and Naples and completed her doctoral thesis at the University of Salzburg. Her special field of research is Aegean epigraphy and Mycenaean Linear B inscriptions, as well as ancient textile production. She was, from 2005 to 2016, the director of the Danish National Research Foundation's Center for Textile Research at the University of Copenhagen, and has been professor of ancient Greek history at the University of Copenhagen since 2011. She was elected to the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters in 2017 and served as its president from 2020 to 2024. Just a quick reminder that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes for this episode. And once again, Lesky is on Instagram at Lesky Podcast, so you might want to follow the show there for new episode announcements. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesky Marie-Louise Noche. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
I come from ancient history and ancient Greek history, and my research topic for many years has been Mycenaean textiles and Linear B. So these are very, very rich sources about weaving and spinning and spinners and wool and flax. And they come on these Linear B tablets, small recordings on clay that were accidentally preserved when the palaces collapsed. So that was my entry into textiles, like a snapshot of the palace economy in Knossos and Mycenae and the Mycenaean palaces. But with time, as I think it is in a scholarship, we tend to find interest also a little bit beyond our field, and I felt really a longing to expand my area of scholarship and go into classical and Hellenistic sources to see, because I have such rich material on textile production in the Linear B records, but it's puzzling that the main sources we use for classical Greek history, we don't have so much information. It's like people are existing and talking and doing, but we don't know much about how they were clothed or how they made the textiles. And it's, of course, because it's a total shift of genre. For example, Thucydides rarely speaks about clothing, and it's just not the topic. But I wanted to go into the area and I thought if I look carefully, I might find something. And at the same time, I felt that there's an interesting crossover in the discussions of time. There's a huge scholarship on time in antiquity. But coming from Linear B, where time is such an acute element of such a very precise part of our scholarship to date the tablets, and then going into Homer, where, what is the date of Homer? What is time in Homer? And also in classical times, where I could see that time was very much something about chronologies and priests and wars and the completely different aspects of time. So that's why, I felt like there's an interesting crossover between how do we produce textiles, what is this realm of textiles in a new time dimension that is classical and Hellenistic history. Yeah. So then I just started digging and finding and trying to find out what does the temporality of textiles actually look like when it's not written by a scribe on a clay tablet, but it's what really people do. And I've come to think that the temporality of textile making, spinning, weaving, sheep, wool, flax is just quite different from the other temporalities that we focus on in antiquity, which are more linear temporalities and historical temporalities. And to capture textile and clothing, there is something completely different about time. It's about rhythm. It's about periodicity, something that comes back every year. And we can see that it's often connected to women's time, to gender time, and to religious time in cults. Of course, most famously in the weaving of the peplus for Athena in Athens, where we know that it takes a whole year from the Chalcaea festival of warping to the spinning and weaving and the presenting, and then again to recruit new young girls and start all over again. And so this strong annual aspect, which is very closely associated to textile production, but also to clothing, because we know we have winter clothing, summer clothing, we have different climates. We need different clothing also in ancient Greece, in winter and summer. So yeah, the annual aspect and the annual temporality is very important, both for garments and textiles.
Yeah, you find so many different kinds of temporality to speak about, to write about with the textiles. So beyond this, the annual cyclical instances, like with the weaving of the peplos, what were some other temporal categories or markers that you focused on?
Well, I felt that there's the lifespan and the temporality of being born, living, and dying. And there, textiles and fibers played a role as well. Wool marks the birth of a little girl. When in Athens a child is born, an olive branch is put on the door for a boy, and wool is put for a girl. So life comes out of wool in that way, and we also know the narratives about the shroud from Penelope to other things about sources talking about that you end your life also wrapped in textiles. And there is, for all the big events in a life, giving birth, the rites, the initiations rites and the marriage, there are pieces of clothing that are recommended to wear. Of course, not everybody would have the resources to wear it, because another very, very important temporality of textiles is the time to produce it. And so we have been able to work with weavers and spinners and to calculate the amounts of time, the many, many, many hours if it is needed. So having different pieces of clothing is a sign of having a lot of time, and also having the resources to put other people's time to work for you and to make garments.
Yeah, I think some of the practical archaeology that you discuss, where the recreations in particular of how long it would have taken to make a sail for an Athenian trireme, is completely astounding. And I think that puts that the fleet in a whole new perspective.
My colleague Eva Andersson Strand, who is also an expert in Viking age, says that this is the only time when the sagas, when a hero cries, it's because he's lost his sail. Because it was so valuable. And I mean, this is a part of my scholarship that I really owe to the collaboration I have with weavers and spinners who can explain all this to me. But it is astonishing figures, yeah.
Perhaps we could talk a little bit about, what you discuss at the beginning of the book. And I also found this really striking. But the notion that the origin of the beginning of textile production is pegged in a way to the beginning of civilization in certain narratives. Could you maybe, and you bring in comparative evidence there as well from beyond the world of Greek antiquity. Could you say maybe a little bit about that, about these creation myths that address weaving and dressing?
Yeah, I think it's something we find in different places that civilization means to wear something woven. We can also see it in as a topos in ancient Greek literature that, for example, shepherds, they live outside the city and they wear fur. So wearing fur and skin garments is a little bit meaning that you are not a civilized person. Wearing woven textiles, and this idea about getting dressed to start civilization, we know from Adam and Eve in the Quran, the Ancient Testament, and we can also see that as one of the first actions of Pandora, the creation of a woman, is that Athena teaches her to weave. So it's both the start of a story, and it's also one of the core skills that women and humans need to have in order to have civilization.
Well, I found really fascinating this point that you make, and I'll just read a brief quotation from your book, is that, and this is in reference to thinking about periodization of human history, that you suggest that as an alternative periodization, so alternative to the idea of the eras of different metals, you write, textile fibers could form the chronological framework for Europe, and one could divide history into the plant fiber age, the wool age, and then the man-made fiber age, the polyester era,
yeah.
I suppose, of modernity. And I thought that was, in some ways, not only does that passage, bring a perspective on textiles, but also on the tendentiousness, on the bias of the way that history is currently periodized. I found that really fascinating. I mean, what kinds of developments do we see over the course of Greek antiquity in textile methodologies?
I want to say that actually we don't see so many in the way that, what we are still wearing today is still threads twined together as fabrics. So a lot of these things are also really, really slow at changing. And even though we have new kinds of fibers today, we still use wool and we still use flax and plant fibers. And but if we look more closely to the innovations, I think a main innovation comes around the end of the Bronze Age. And it's actually really interesting because we see the shift from bronze to iron, and we also see a shift in dressing. A lot of pins are worn, clothing is wrapped around the body and fixed with pins in a way that we didn't see to the same degree in the Bronze Age. But this change actually occurs at the end of the Bronze Age, before the Iron Age starts. So in a way, we can say that the main shift that happens in technology happens first in textiles and garments, and then comes the adaptation of iron. So it's not always aligned with the shift between metals and the ways we dress. But then there is a main shift when around Roman times, Hellenistic times, when new fibers appear. When people get cotton and they get silk, these really, really fascinating new, and also probably new dyes from early trades along the Silk Roads and in the Levant. These are probably really sought after innovations and new products coming in.
It's striking when you you say there that how new products coming in, this makes me think of how that might have changed the rhythm of life in a way that is articulated around the making of textiles. And maybe you could say a little bit about, you write about textiles and time cycles in terms of seasons and rhythm in particular. I found a really interesting passage. Yeah, could you say a little bit about maybe the seasonal operation of textiles, or the seasonal rhythms first?
In ancient Greece, it would be in March or April. People would start cultivate or grow, sow flax, and this would also be the time when lambs would come. So you could also from lambs get lamb wool, and then in June would be the time for sharing wool, but also would be the time for harvesting flax, and harvesting also in the summer you would harvest plant fibers. So there is this fiber acquisition from both animals and plants going on. And then from these raw fibers start a series of processes that can take longer or shorter according to how fine a fabric you want. So if you want something coarse, you can use coarse wool. If you want it really fine, you need a lot of time to clean wool, wash it, comb it, and prepare it for spinning. And the same with flax and hemp. There was a great use of hemp as well. That needs even longer time because it needs to be both worked mechanically and beaten, but also it needs to be retted, meaning it has to lie in ponds for some time and have some of the outer parts dissolved so that the thin fibers inside can come out. So there's a long time and a lot of manual work coming into it. And then starts the spinning and weaving. And this would naturally be something that you would do in an agrarian society in the times when you had more time. In winter, for spinning, it's good to have light because you sometimes need to see your threads when you spin thin. But it's typically something people would do in the winter. And of course, we can use a lot of ethnographic parallels for this as well. And then when you come to spring, you would be ready to shape it and make it into the clothing and the cloak you want to do, and then a new cycle starts. So for textiles, I can say that the bottleneck is not really the fibers. You can get wool and you can get plant fibers by harvesting it, but the bottleneck is the very many hours you need to spin and weave it to get it something. But that's also the magic thing about textiles, that you can take something of quite a cheap, very cheap raw product that you can produce by yourself. And then if you have labor, you can transform it into something quite valuable, a fabric. And we know from prices, and we know from inscription materials that fabric and clothing are very costly. So this is something that a household can do. And that's why also women come to play a special role. Enslaved labor, children, old people, everybody who could use their hands and eyes and fingers could produce, transform this cheap material into something valuable. And in economic terms, I think it's important to say that grain and wine and olive oil is also similar products, but you can't keep them for many, many years, whereas textiles you can keep for generations and they will still have value. It's a very important part of the household economy. But also, as I said, I come from the Mycenaean part, is also a very important part of the palace economies in the Bronze Age. It's just a source of wealth.
Right. Yeah, I think the durability, and you bring out some of these passages where we get references to multiple generations of women working on something and then dedicating something and naming the multiple generations is something that really endures and is meant to endure beyond the lifetime of a single person, I think is really striking. To return to the kind of flow of the year, the pulse of the year, when it's time actually for the weaving, you had some interesting points that you made about the actual practical, the rhythm of the loom, the sound of the loom moving as its own kind of pulse in the household. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, I can really add a very personal dimension because in the Center for Textile Research, where I work with my colleagues, we have had weavers working with us. And for many months, we would listen to the sounds of the looms from the morning to the evening. And there is a special rhythm in it. It's first the sound of inserting a weft, then it's beating the weft upwards that gives a special sound, and then it's changing the sheds. And when you do that on a warp-weighted loom, you have the stones or the loom weights making a kind of, I won't say music, but a sound that says boom, 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 boom. And then you start over again, insert. And all this sounds of wood, stone, and clay touching each other or making strong noises comes with this rhythm that is like every minute, every second minute, you hear it all over again, you hear it all over again. And we were sitting, a lot of scholars around this loom, and we could, in the end, it was like we couldn't write or read because suddenly we would be stuffed. It was like everybody would pause and wait until the change of the shed again, and then we could relax again. And I think we all gained this really physical experience, what it would be to be in a household in antiquity where this sound would be there all the time. And of course, if you were weaving something very delicate, the sounds would be in a certain way. And if you would weave something coarse, it would maybe be stronger noises and less carefully made. So I think even from the sounds, you would, when entering an ancient household, you would be able to hear what rhythm is there, what sound, and what were they weaving without seeing it. And this is a soundscape that is completely lost to us today, but I feel we really experienced in the Center for Textile Research.
The work of the center, maybe we could return to this question of just how long it takes to spin and to weave. Well, do you mind describing a little bit some of the, we could say experiments or practical explorations of those kinds of questions?
So we found some spinners who have been spinning primarily in open-air museums. So they had a really good training in spinning at a very high pace. And still, even they were very, very good, I'm not sure that they were as fast as a woman were in antiquity, but they were very good. And they could spin wool and flax, which are also quite different to spin with. It's not the same. And so we set it up like an experiment in medicine, where you would test new medicine. So we had different kinds of wool, different kinds of spindle whorls, different kinds of spindles, different kinds of, and then we would have a blind test and not tell the spinners what tools and what fibers we were using. And then for every hour, we would measure how long did they spin, and also per 100 grams, how many meters could they spin. And so after doing this for many, many months, we had enough documentation to show that it was not so much the individual spinner as it was really the fiber preparation and the tools that determined how much you can spin. If you want to spin a very thin thread, you might spin something like 30 meters per hour, 40. If you want to spin something coarse, you can spin 50, 60 meters per hour. But still, you would need at least, several kilometers of thread in order to make a piece of fabric. And for the sail, this is, of course, it's all a hypothesis. But if one person should spin and weave all the yarn for one sail on a trireme, it would be at least something like 4 years full-time job for one woman. Of course, we can imagine there was not just one woman spinning, but that just represents an enormous amount of work that need to be freed time to be free to make this. And so for clothing a household, you would have to constantly work fibers, spin, and have a loom standing ready. We say that you need to spin something like 10 hours before you can weave 1 hour. So spinning is much more time-consuming than weaving. So spinning would really be what was going on. Once you had enough yarn to weave, it would another temporality would start, another work.
I think here too we had her as a guest last year on the podcast, but Andromache Karanika, yes. And her, would you bring in? Yeah, her wonderful
I love her work.
Yeah. Do you want to just maybe say, so for listeners, we had Andromache come on and talk about the nuptial poetics in Homer, but her earlier book had been about women's work songs and the kinds of evidence we have, these traces of songs that women would have sung as they did this very boring, very long work. And I was curious, what you made of that, Mary Louise.
I think it's fascinating, and I'm very interested in the work songs as well. There is also a German scholar from the 19th century, Karl Bücher, who also collected work songs and was interested in this connection between music, repetitive work, and narratives also, and how you can use songs and writing, like songs and narratives to make a pastime, but also sometimes actually to memorize patterns, to explain to children. You would always have children around who had to learn to spin also, to let them, to teach them and train them in spinning. And we also have some songs in Danish that are called old spinning songs, because it's something with very much a repetition, and then a new element is added, and then you repeat again and you repeat again. And I think that I like spinning also. I'm not a very good spinner, but those who really enjoy spinning say that there is also some kind of flow that you get into when you spin. And so I can imagine that these very repetitive songs would work very well. Weaving is a different story. I mean, if you have to weave something complicated, you need to focus. You should sing at the same time. Maybe if you are weaving a sail or something, you could sing as well. But weaving requires a lot of counting and precision and completely other movements. So you would strain your body in another way if you weave a lot. I would like to read a passage, and there it's about time and waiting, and how we measure waiting through weaving in ancient text. Women in Homeric epics weave as a necessity and to make time pass. Time is measured in the weaving. As the fabric expands on the loom, they can see how much time they've spent weaving and waiting. Philologist Maria Pantelia argues that married elite women in Homeric poems, they weave especially in dire situations of domestic instability. And in contrast, when then the domestic stability is achieved, they start to spin. And so I think it's what Maria Pantelia has demonstrated here is this situation that in Homer, when married women weave, not Calypso and Kirke, but then they stand in a waiting position. Penelope is waiting, and she is weaving, and in her weave is like uniting the past and the present, but also the future, because she's weaving a shroud for the future death of somebody. But also Andromache and Helena in Troy, they are waiting for the war to end. And so there is in weaving this interesting combination of past, present, and future, and waiting. And some scholars also see this as a way where women can express a voice. The idea that they weave maybe picture motifs of what is going on, how they interpret the situation. But what Pantelia has seen then is that in other situations, women start to spin yarn, which, as I told you, is the most time-consuming and something that maybe elite women would do, but they would certainly also have some enslaved or some children to do it as well, because it's very long. But for example, when Helena returns to Sparta and she reunites with Menelaus, and then they have the visit from Telemachus, Helena is said that she sits and spins. And also in the Phaeacians, in the islands where Nausicaa where Odysseus meets Nausicaa, the queen is sitting and spinning. So spinning is in some way domestic order, happiness, marriage, and love, and the world is okay again when the women spin. And I find that's an interesting reading of these few passages in Homer, and it tells us something about the waiting time and how spinning, because in textile work, there is always a lot of the projection of the future. You will always produce something that you plan should hold for at least a generation. So when making a textile, making a thread, you would from the start have an idea about what kind of fabric am I making here. You can't change the plan on the way. You need to have a focus. And I like this very much, this time. That time is kind of spun into the threads and the fabrics from the beginning, and projections of the future.
I think in a way it makes me think too that what you were saying earlier about how you couldn't really be singing and weaving something complicated, it helps to explain maybe why Andromache, after she's bid Hector goodbye, I mean, she goes to weaving. I mean, maybe it's like completely taking her mind off it, it's because it is so absorbing. And then, of course, when she gets the news of his death, that's when she drops the shuttle. But yeah, it's just kind of an interesting, why would she go to weaving? Maybe it's something that requires such absorption.
Yeah, and she weaves flowers, whereas Helena weaves images of the war, Troy, between the Trojans and the Greeks. So they each have their own image of and their own way of coping with the situation, perhaps.
Well, maybe in terms of these textiles, now that we've spoken a little bit about how much time and labor is involved in their production, maybe we could talk about the lifetime of a textile itself. And actually, when you write about the lifespan and the time span of garments, you begin by talking about Andromache's own wedding veil. Would you like to say a few words about that really extraordinary garment?
Yeah, because as you say, when she learns of her husband's death, she dropped her shuttle. That's what it says in the kerkis, the shuttle, which is the weftvita or something that was used on the loom. But it also then comes also a long description that she loses her headband, her hairnet, and her garment that she has over her head. And this veil is something that was offered to her by Aphrodite on the day she got married. So she's still wearing something that was a gift on the day of her wedding. And I feel that's also very symbolic of dropping the spindle and losing this precious memory. And it shows also that I don't know how many years had passed from her marriage to her husband's death, but she has kept it for a long time and still wears it. And this is, I think, something that's really difficult for us to understand today, how much time, how long people would wear their clothing. I've been involved in some carbon-14 analysis of textiles in graves in Greece, and we are surprised to see that the carbon-14 of the grave and the carbon-14 of the textiles, they do not match, because often the textiles are much older than the burial, meaning that people would deposit old textiles, but not in the meaning of rags, but probably textiles that had been in the family for a long time, maybe had belonged to the grandparents or in the family. So we know that there is this idea, and one of the hypotheses that I have in the book is that maybe we should think about textiles as something that actually gains value with time. And today we think about that clothing loses value with time, but also the textiles that are kept in sanctuaries, we know that they are kept for a very long time, even if they are like rags and useless and worn out. But there is something about the value that remains or maybe even increases. And then I feel that in the passages from Greek tragedy, when people talk about weaving and textiles, there is an echo of this value, because the textiles are so valuable and not mass produced. It's something that is produced in the home, so people will remember the significant textiles of a family. And I can maybe read a little passage about that.
Yes,
as well.
please, yeah.
So in ancient Greek literature, textiles and clothing in particular were a means of establishing, strengthening, and confirming family and emotional ties. family history was woven into the social fabric in the form of dowry textiles from the wife's family, and in the domestic household textiles of beds and living spaces. Cushions, mattresses, blankets and curtains, rugs and carpets, or woven ornamental heritage wall hangings with inwoven motifs. On a smaller scale, more intimate, it could also be in the form of a little girl's first sample of weaving with carefully selected yarns and designs. And we can see that there are some of these very iconic recognition scenes in Greek tragedies where families are reunited, and you can say in a way also harmony is recovered again when people identify each other through textiles. And I especially appreciate the example from Aeschylus where there is a brother and a sister, Orestes and Electra, and they haven't seen each other for many, many years. And he tries to prove that he is really her brother. And he talks about his footstep, and he even takes his own hair. And today would be, a hair sample would really be the DNA strands, and this is how we would identify tissue and DNA. But that is not what is really important here. The main proof, it's when he tells about a piece of fabric that she wove when she was a little girl, and probably one of these weaving samples where she was training to learn how to do tapestry weave, and he can remember that it was a wild animal that she wove, and he still has it with him. It was a gift that this little girl had given to him. And so this is, I think, a topos in ancient literature and fiction about how a piece of fabric is really full of memories and also a token of recognition and identification. Because we find it in other tragedies later also about this. And
you write about it in Euripides' Ion, which it's just such a heart-rending scene. I think it adds this other dimension because, how they're in that basket is Creusa's sampler. Yes. And it also just kind of throws you back to how she was just a girl when this happened. I mean, it's so emotional, I think. Yeah. Can I just actually ask you, since I have you on the line, the question of figurative weaving, when does that start? Because I've read, obviously we have Helen and Andromache, we have it preserved in the Homeric epics, but then I've read literature that says that for the Mycenaean period, it's not quite, or when do we think that they're able to start doing figures in using the looms?
I think they've always been able to do it. Because it's not difficult. You need to have some threads under tension, like you can have a little frame and you can put threads in under tension. And then you weave in patterns. You weave a flower. You can make a little gorgon face or an animal. By inserting weft threads in different shapes and then filling out the blanks with other colors. It's really not difficult. In Mycenaean, what the issue is here that what we have in the Linear B are such standardized large-scale production records. So they're all similar. They have the same name, and we know how much wool they used. So there we think that it's just probably just tabbies, very simple woven pieces of fabric that could be used for garments afterwards. But I think it's always been there that you will fit. The main issue with tapestry weave is that it would have sparked innovation and fantasy the moment when wool was used, because wool can absorb color in a way that plant fibers cannot. And so when you have colorful yarns, you will be able to make braiding with your fingers, and you can mix blue and yellow and make. And I think it's easier to do pattern weave when you have different colored yarns than if you have only natural fibers that don't absorb the color in the same way. But I don't know, the scale of innovation and ingenuity of early textiles is amazing. We have very, very fine fabrics, very fine threads, inwoven golds, dyed with murex. It's like there's so much fantasy and craftsmanship going in. I think they could do anything.
It's incredible. Yeah, I think it boggles the mind. Well, but I also wanted to actually come back to something that you were saying about the way that textiles gain value over time. It's not like this, notion that when you buy a car, however many thousands of dollars it loses the minute you drive away from the dealership. But I mean, the quite the opposite with these textiles. And one thing that really struck me is the practice of dedicating frayed, worn out. The word that keeps coming up in these inventories is useless textiles to the gods, to a goddess at a temple. I mean, could you say a little bit more about, the idea that, today we would take some, H&M shirt that we have that's frayed or whatever and go and dedicate, it becomes a piece of junk. But for them, it's something that is worthy of dedication, often to a goddess. Could you say a little bit about that?
Definitely. It's especially my colleague Cecilie Brøns who has gathered all this in her book about gods and garments. And it seems that it's a phenomenon that it's not in every sanctuary. It's especially in sanctuaries for female deities. But there is also from some male deities. It also looks like that it's mainly women who dedicate these textiles, but we don't know it everywhere. We know it in some sanctuaries where it's said who dedicates textiles. And the women who dedicate textiles, they give new stuff, old stuff. They give men's shirts, women's dresses, everything. So it can it seems like that is a praxis where a lot of possibilities are open. You can also give belts or scarves or many kinds of textiles. And then we have these inventories where it doesn't really say who is dedicating, but it's an annual inventory of a sanctuary. And there it is really puzzling how textiles that are clearly described with different adjectives saying that they can no longer be worn, probably not even put on display anymore in the sanctuaries, but they're still a part of the inventory, meaning that they were not discarded, they were not thrown away, as many other dedications probably were, like edible stuff and so. But the textiles stayed there and were part of the inventories. And it must mean that these were it was simply not easy to discard them, or nobody wanted it, because they were still imbued with value in the sanctuary context. In a household context, it could be different. You would wear something until it was rags, then you would reuse it for cloth, for isolation, for hygiene, anything. But in sanctuaries, and also in burials, of course, there would be this idea that something that is old would be of value and would maybe show the intention of the family in a better way than something newly made. Also because maybe people didn't have so much newly made always.
That comes back to your work on this, the intersection between the textiles and memory. You can imagine people dedicating something, an old, unwearable now garment, but that maybe has these intergenerational memories sort of are now a part of it. It's I think quite moving. I actually have done several times little podcast stories with my students today that are, Danish students in university. And I asked them to make an interview with a fellow student and also with their grandparents or somebody from an older generation. And they're very interesting stories, because often what we tend to keep in our closets, and that has a lot of meaning, are pieces of clothing that maybe were gifted from our grandparents or our mother, sister, something that we got as a gift from somebody that we like. So these mechanisms are still there, even with H&M, and so that we keep clothing with special meaning. I am curious to hear you speak a bit about fashion changes, if we can call them that, in antiquity. Even if the production processes remain remarkably stable. I mean, what kind of evidence do we find of changing fashion in Greek antiquity?
Well, first of all, I think fashion it's such a difficult word for us in ancient history because, I tend to associate it with a capitalist cycle, colonial trade, cheap labor, all these things. But what we can see is that some ancient sources seem to report that there are some changes in ways that people would dress. There is the famous story told by Herodotus about that women would change their dress from a dress that was pinned on the shoulders to a chiton. It doesn't actually say that they wore a peplos. It just says it's a dress that was pinned. And because these women would kill somebody with their dress pin, they were not allowed to wear it anymore. So this is a way that Herodotus tells this very, very strange story about a kind of fashion change, but due to a tragic political event of somebody being killed. And it's hard to document in archaeology that this was really taking place. What we can see is that the peplos seems to be seen in some periods as a kind of old-fashioned, a little bit traditional, the good old days dress, because it's those women who wear a peplos are maybe in a ritual situation, or they're priestesses, or they are female divinities. So the peplos is kind of a not fashionable garment. It's something that shows that you are respecting tradition. Whereas the chiton, which becomes then the name for a more fashionable or thinner and not pinned on the shoulder but stitched garment, has this idea of the younger and the more fashionable garment. And that's very peculiar for me, because since I come from the Linear B studies, where we have the chiton, kipto in Mycenae, and is already there. So we can't say that it's something that was invented in the 4th century. It's a very, very old garment term that is also in many Semitic languages meaning a garment. So it's definitely been there for a long time. Whereas peplos is something that it's a word that appears in the first millennium, and also with an etymology where we're not so sure where it comes from. So it seems to be a little bit a special garment. So that's one shift. And for the men, there is also this narrative, the story by Thucydides about that men who used to be very fashionable, the old generation, they would wear gold and glamorous pattern textiles. So, but today, it tells in this very moralizing way that today people wear more modest clothing, wool, and something more simple. And that's what is nice to wear today. And there we can say, is that fashion? Is it moralizing discourse? Or is it just a generational thing about we don't want to wear what our grandparents used to live, or the old men used to live? We want to be a new kind of man. So I'm very, very insecure about how to understand the changes in clothing. Yeah.
It's hard, I think, even to understand in that passage of Thucydides, because he does say that the present day is more modest, but on the other hand, the description of the old dress is very much linked to this idea of like Ionian unity and like the magic of the Ionian past and like the robes of the Ionians.
But there is also this passage there where it said that you shouldn't slap somebody in the street because you can't know if it's a slave or a foreigner or a citizen, because everybody wears the same. Now they talk about
the old oligarch.
All men wear the same today. So that's also a testimony that there is a more of a leveling. I won't call it democratic fashion, but a leveling it. And then there is, of course, the topos that is across all ancient literature, is that you should never be too fashionable, because then you are effeminate and female and weak. And so there is always, especially for men, this narrow path of dressing in the right way, so you blend in, you can look smart, but never too smart.
Yeah, but what we wouldn't pay probably to see what Alcibiades wore. I'm sure he was setting fashions every year with where is he pinning his chiton this year? Where is he,
Absolutely.
In any case, well, Marie-Louise, this is just such an incredibly rich topic, and I think that with all this, the sources that you've found, I mean, even just mentioning this passage of the old Oligarch, we just had gone through that in my Greek history class, I think, last week, but for reflections on Athenian practices of enslavement and their perception. But it's so interesting to think of that also as a piece of testimony for dress. It's really incredible. So I've been ending the podcast this season by asking people what you might have been doing lately, or reading or watching or listening to, that has been bringing you some joy. And I'm very curious to hear your answer to that.
I have to say that I very much enjoy costume dramas and seeing how Hollywood and filmmakers render identity through clothing. And then my passion is still the Mycenaean inscription. So I'm returning a little bit back to my safe space of Linear B and working on textiles, yeah.
Are you watching the new season of Bridgerton?
Absolutely. It's fantastic.
So the dress is so incredible. It's die
so
for.
Incredible, and it's so anachronic. It's so not correct in any terms, the dresses. But you understand, it's a language. It is really, as Roland Barthes explained to us, it is a language. And we can understand this language.
Yeah, that shows it's complete eye candy. The colors, in any case, it's been wonderful to hear about your work. And I think that this will excite a lot more people, to think more carefully about textiles and time together in the future. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesky Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesky.